Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, I have come to set the earth on fire, and how I wish it were already blazing. There is a baptism with which I must be baptized, and how great is my anguish until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to establish peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, a household of 5 will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. A father will be divided against his son, and a son against his father. A mother against her daughter, and a daughter against her mother. A mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Some people say that things tend to happen in threes, and I can say that in these last couple of weeks, this is a sort of third reminder that God is calling me to step outside of my comfort zone, to do things that, are intrinsic and necessary for being a good priest, but things that I may not immediately gravitate towards or enjoy. Number one, he has reminded me a number of times of my inherent fear of public speaking. Every time I come up here, even though I've been a priest for now going on, 2 years, I still get terrified every time I approach this ambo. Number two, a couple of weeks ago, during a weekday homily, maybe to put it in more colloquial language, the Spirit put it on my heart to talk about asking for money, not actually asking for money, but reminding people of the necessity to support the church financially. And this today, these readings from the Gospel, is a sort of third strike against my comfort zone, the fear of challenging people. I hope you are paying attention to the Gospel reading, because it is very challenging. It is a very, very challenging passage, and they're hard. And we faithful, we Catholics, including especially priests, bishops, deacons, those entrusted with the governance of the church, we shy away from them at our peril. To simply walk away or ignore, let it pass on by and let's get to the nice and warm, fuzzy aspects of the Bible and of Jesus, is dangerous, is spiritually dangerous for us. Christ makes it very, very clear. He is a source of division, and he drives home that point by showing he causes division in families. The most intimate relationships, he divides even that. As our society becomes less Christian, and it's been going this way for quite some time, as it becomes less influenced by the faith, less influenced by, say, Christian or Catholic ideas, those of us who choose to remain, who choose to be Catholic, that is the result of a conscious, deliberate choice. Not one that your family makes, not one that you make as a member of a cultural group or an ethnicity, but that one that is made because you yourself believe that it is a path worth following. Which means to be Catholic means to live differently. To live differently, and often differently amongst those that we love, those that we respect, those whose opinion we treasure the most, our relatives. And oftentimes that difference is stark. And the division that comes about because of that different way of living is indeed painful. Maybe your family is not like most, but to be honest, I don't know of a family that is not divided because of Christ. Every single family, including my own, experiences Christ as a source of division. Whether it's in the more immediate family, between children and parents, or even in the extended relationships between nieces and nephews and cousins and great-grandparents and so on. Most families now experience Christ as a source of division. That's the way it is. So how can we understand this, right? How do we understand Jesus' challenging words in today's gospel with maybe our knee-jerk reaction to seeing Jesus, someone who's nice, someone who's kind, right? At Christmas we hear that over and over again, Prince of Peace, Prince of Peace, Prince of Peace. How do we square these two things? How can they be reconciled? The answer to that question lies in the answer to another question. What does God's love look like in a world that has gone wrong? What is axiomatic, what is unchanging, always and everywhere the same, is that God is love. Love is not an analogy for God. It's not an image of God. It's not a good explanation of God. As we hear in the first letter of John, Deus caritas est. God is love, period. This is an axiom, if you will. We perceive God's love. We receive God's love in a very certain context, in a very specific context. The one that I have in mind is that of brokenness. We experience God's love in the midst of a fallen, in the midst of a broken world. The language that Scripture and the Church uses to describe the brokenness and the fallenness of our world is sin. We live in a sinful world. We live in a broken world. And this isn't just the people around us, or the music that we listen to, or the movies that we watch. We ourselves are broken. Our minds and our hearts are broken. We are so easily inclined to sin, and I am definitely including myself in this category of y'all. I am definitely a sinner. Every single Sunday, every single day, I celebrate Mass, right? And every single day I can think of ways that I have failed to live up to the person who calls me to love, to respond to his love. We are easily tempted. We are so weak. And it is into this brokenness that we receive God's love. So God is love, and we receive his love in the context of sin, in the context of weakness. My Dominican brother, St. Thomas Aquinas, brilliant man, rephrased an idea from Aristotle, who was also brilliant, I suppose. And the Latin phrase that Thomas Aquinas, one of course many, that I'm sure you all know by heart because you're good UD students. And you know it in Latin because you are excellent UD students. Quid recipitur, ad modum recipientis recipitur. And for people like myself who are weak, not like you, wonderful UD students who can speak and understand Latin on a moment's notice, the English translation of this phrase goes like this. That which is received according to the mode of the receiver. What does Thomas Aquinas mean, for example? Maybe some of you are like me. I do not like mornings. I am not a morning person. Maybe, hopefully, one day before I die, I will look with joy instead of with disdain and disgust on a sunrise. Ideally, I would love to do that, but I just can't. I take several hours to wake up and several cups of coffee to form a coherent sentence. So if you're like me and you struggle to get out of bed in the morning and get your rear into gear, who are the worst people to be around? Morning people. They're the worst. Because they're so cheery. They have a nice smile on their face. They woke up looking immaculately perfect somehow. They are obnoxious. They are annoying. They're, I'll say terrible, but you get the drift. If you struggle to wake up, the last thing you want to see is someone who does it so easily. Another example. Think back to, for most of you, I suppose, freshman year. One of the first books that you read in Phil and F was Plato's Republic, and one of the most frequently cited images from the Republic is the image of the cave, right? Freshmen are going to be reading this in the next few weeks. When that person comes out of the cave, after a lifetime of looking at shadows on the cave wall, what does he encounter that is painful? The sun. He encounters the light of the sun, and because his eyes are not used to this, he is temporarily blinded. Now, is the light doing anything malicious? No. The light's just doing its thing. It's just shining everywhere. But it is because his eyes are not used to the overwhelming power of the sun that he is blinded, that it is, if you will, an enemy. This is what Aquinas means. That which is received according to the mode of the receiver. We live in a sinful world. So when we encounter God's love, we sometimes encounter it as a fire, as something that is piercing, painful, judgmental, burning even, because we receive as broken creatures. If we're in a good spiritual place, if our minds and our hearts are set on God and on Christ, we will probably experience God's grace as pleasant, as kind, as wonderful, as good. But if we're mired in sin, if sin has taken a deep root in our mind and in our heart, if our spiritual lives are off kilter, we will experience God's grace, God's love, as a burning, judging fire. Christ breaks up our false peace with the same fervor of a consuming fire, and it indeed hurts. Now, God does not enjoy making us suffer. He's not some sick old man in the sky who likes to see us writhe the same way you might have fried ants when you were a kid. No, He doesn't like to see us writhe. He likes to see us love and be free. What He wants to do is do the same thing that happens when the impurities of gold and surrounding precious stones are purified and melted away so that the gem and that stone can become radiant. He wants to burn away in us everything that keeps us from Him. As a Boy Scout, one of the things that I remember kind of surprising me was the necessity of forest fires. Because I sort of just assumed fires are always and everywhere bad in forests, but not so. Because the undergrowth of a forest can become so thick and so unable for the sun to penetrate to the forest floor that not even rain in some cases can get into the soil to give the soil the nutrition that it needs. So a sort of natural result of the forest taking care of itself is drying out and being ready like a tinderbox, ready to go for a fire. Fire is devastating, yes, but it allows new life to come forth. New trees are able to come forth. The sun and the rain are able to penetrate where previously they could not. So too it is with us. That is a good analogy for the fire that Christ speaks about. One that clears away the brush, the things that keep us in the dark, that keep us from God. But is that the end of the story? Is that what we're left with? The piercing, awful, horrifying, painful fire. Is that all we're left with? Is division in our families and division within ourselves? Hopefully, because you're good listeners and listen to the text that is proclaimed, if you were able to get past those difficult words of Christ, did you notice that He was oddly specific? He was very specific about the division that will come about in families. 3 against 2, 2 against 3, and then He very specifically names those relations. Now, some scripture scholars will point out over and over again, when Jesus' words seem strangely specific, it's because He wants His audience to think back to the Old Testament. Because, of course, like good Jews, like you memorized Latin and Greek phrases, they would have memorized the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. And indeed, that is what Jesus was referring to. Unfortunately, He was not quoting the first reading. He was not quoting from Jeremiah. He was quoting from another prophet, Micah. The son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. Almost verbatim, Jesus is quoting the prophet Micah. To summarize the prophet Micah in 15 words or less, the drama of that book is that of a promise of reconciliation. God bringing the lost tribes of Israel back together to Himself. But before that time of reunification, there would be a time of great strife and division. The source of division is God. But this division cuts even to families. So salvation is coming, but it's not immediately a utopia. A time of pain will come first. This is what Christ is saying. Listen up. This is coming. I am bringing this fulfillment at hand. It is here. Which means the division that all of us experience within our families, that strife that we experience because of disagreement in the name of Christ, these trials, these tribulations are also a sign of hope. They're a sign of hope in the same way that the crucifix, that the cross is a sign of hope. Because the cross leads to the resurrection, because Calvary leads to the empty tomb. Suffering is not eternal. It is purifying, and it leads to new life. So what can we do? Well, for each of us, before we start looking at other people, we can look at our own lives. We can look at those ways in which we have said no to God, and instead we allow Him to burn away all that keeps us from Him. We can't lie to ourselves, right? That's sort of the project of the liberal arts, is to see reality clearly, to see each of us as we truly are, to see our relationships as they truly are, means to be honest where we are divided amongst friends and amongst families, but also to note areas in which we do agree, areas in which we do agree with people that do not share our faith. I'd say the last and the most important thing to resist. We have a tendency, once we recognize separation and disagreement, to easily become embittered, to look at people with whom we disagree and point our finger at them and say, they are the problem. And it can let our hearts become hardened. Christ forbids us from being bitter. Absolutely. That is an absolute commandment that he has given to us. Resist bitterness. He forgave to the very end, and he calls us to do likewise, no matter what's the cost. As we prepare to come forward to receive the divine gift of his body and blood, may we allow Christ to burn away everything that keeps us from him, and always and everywhere refuse to be possessed by bitterness.